My name is Emily, and I need you to listen closely. Imagine walking into a room filled with sparkling chandeliers, designer gowns, and polished shoes tapping against marble floors. That was my family's annual reunion, a ritual I had grown to dread. The air was heavy with perfume and superiority, a suffocating blend that clung to every conversation. My relatives traded stories about million-dollar deals and high-powered positions, each tale dripping with arrogance. And me, I stood quietly in the corner dressed in a plain black gown chosen not for beauty but for camouflage. It was supposed to make me invisible, but my aunt's sharp voice cut through the chatter like a blade. "Emily, dear, still working as a secretary." Her words landed like darts, followed by a chorus of smug laughter. I lifted my champagne glass, hiding a private smile, and replied with the gentlest correction. "Administrative assistant, actually." She arched one perfect brow, mocking me as if even that small upgrade was laughable. Then came Ethan, my cousin, fresh from his father's law firm, eager to remind everyone of his partner status. He leaned in with that condescending smirk I knew too well. "Come on, Em, I could get you a real job, something with actual potential." Around us, the laughter swelled. They saw me as the family underachiever, the woman who never lived up to the Wilson name. But what they didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the stack of contracts waiting for me back at my office were not for someone else's signature. They were for mine. Because I wasn't anyone's assistant. I was the founder, the CEO of Summit Solutions, a consulting empire I had built brick by brick over 10 long years. As I listened to their voices rise bragging about acquisitions and hostile takeovers, I thought of the irony. They laughed at me, yet they were losing battles they didn't even know I had orchestrated. Their failures were my victories, and they had no clue. That night, I let their cruelty wash over me, like it always had. I let them dismiss me, minimize me, erase me. Because I knew a secret that would soon change everything. And in that glittering ballroom, as the crystal chandeliers reflected cold light over my family's mocking faces, I whispered silently to myself, "Just wait." But the truth was coming, and when it did, the world they thought they owned would no longer belong to them. It would belong to me. The laughter around me was still ringing in my ears as I slipped away from the crowded ballroom. My relatives always loved the spotlight. They bathed in it, flaunting every achievement as if it were carved in stone. I learned long ago that silence was more powerful than shouting, so I carried that silence like armor. Still, every time my aunt or cousin cut me down, a part of me wanted to rise to say the words I kept locked behind my teeth. "I am more than what you think I am." But I didn't, not yet. Instead, I remembered the years of being overlooked, of hearing the same refrain, "You're wasting your potential." Aunt Patricia's voice echoed it again that night, dripping with venom, disguised as care. She compared me to her sons, to my cousins, to anyone she believed was climbing higher, partners, executives, men with polished titles, and me, the woman they thought was pushing paper. Ethan joined her chorus. "Emily, really stop pretending. If you want, I can help you get a job that matters. A real career." He said it loud enough for others to hear his smirk, inviting their laughter. In that moment, I looked at him and thought about the truth. About how the contracts he bragged about negotiating meant nothing compared to the deals I closed in silence. About how his law firm's biggest client that year had been my company Summit Solutions, though he never realized it. He believed he was guiding titans of industry. The reality, he was following the path I laid before him. I smiled softly, not because his words were kind, but because they no longer pierced me. They only reminded me of how blind my family had become. Blind to possibility, blind to vision, blind to me. Still, I let them laugh. I let them roll their eyes and sip champagne, convinced they were the pinnacle of success. Why? Because their ignorance was my cover, the shield that allowed me to build an empire while standing right in front of them. Their arrogance made me invisible, and invisibility was the greatest power I ever had. I excused myself from the conversation, murmuring something about needing fresh air. I wandered to a quiet corner of the mansion, watching the glitter of the chandeliers from a distance. And for just a moment, I wondered how many others had felt what I felt: dismissed, underestimated, ignored. Maybe you've been there too. Maybe you've had someone laugh at your dreams or tell you you'd never measure up. If you have, tell me your story in the comments. I want to hear it because these stories matter, and together we can remind each other that we are not alone. As I stood in the shadows of that ballroom, I made a silent promise. Let them believe I was nothing. Let them dismiss me tonight. Tomorrow the curtain would fall and the truth would take center stage. They thought I was weak. They thought I was dependent. They thought I was just another woman in a family that valued men above all. But I was the architect of my own empire, and soon they would see me not as the assistant they mocked, but as the leader they could no longer ignore. And in that quiet moment, I sipped my champagne and allowed myself one small, defiant smile, because the game had only just begun. The night carried on with its usual rhythm: clinking glasses, polite laughter, and hushed whispers of stock prices and acquisitions. I drifted among the glittering crowd like a ghost. Every nod, every dismissive glance, every careless remark carved a memory into me. My family didn't just underestimate me, they erased me. In their eyes, I was the shadow at the edge of their empire, destined to fade away while the men built legacies. But I remembered the beginning. 10 years earlier, I was fresh from business school, holding a diploma in one hand and a dream in the other. I came to this very mansion armed with a revolutionary idea. I had spent sleepless nights perfecting my pitch: how to restructure failing companies, how to breathe life back into businesses everyone else had given up on. I thought my family would listen. After all, they prided themselves on being visionaries. Instead, they laughed. Uncle Robert scoffed first. Consulting. Leave that to the big firms, Emily. You're better off starting in the mailroom of Wilson Ventures and proving yourself like everyone else. His words were sharp, but his meaning was sharper. Everyone else meant the men. The cousins who were groomed from birth to inherit power, while women like me were expected to marry well or take support roles. That night, humiliation burned me alive. My cousins smirked, Aunt Patricia offered a pitying smile, and the conversation moved on as though my dream had never been spoken. But humiliation has a strange way of transforming into resolve. I walked out of that house with two decisions carved into my heart. One, I would build my company without their help, without their permission, without their blessing. Two, I would make them regret every dismissive word. It's strange, isn't it, how those who claim to love you can become the first to clip your wings. Maybe you felt it too. Someone close telling you your dreams are too big, too foolish, too impossible. If you've ever been told to lower your ambitions, let me know in the comments. I want to know how you fought back, or how you're still fighting now. I rented a tiny office above a Chinese restaurant, the smell of sesame oil and stir-fry drifting through the vents as I worked late into the night. My savings barely covered rent, but I had something far more valuable than money. I had knowledge. I understood how companies worked, how they collapsed, and how to rebuild them from ashes. My first client was a small manufacturing firm teetering on bankruptcy. No one else would touch them. They had been rejected by every major consulting firm in the city. I walked in with nothing but my determination and a plan. For 3 months, I buried myself in their operations, streamlining processes, renegotiating debt, and cutting away inefficiency like a surgeon. 6 months later, they were not just alive, they were profitable. That victory was my first taste of power, and the whispers began. Somewhere in the city, business owners started talking about a mysterious firm that could save dying companies. Summit Solutions was born. I didn't plaster my name on billboards or chase headlines. I built in silence. Every employee I hired signed ironclad agreements. My name never appeared on public documents. I was simply the CEO hidden in plain sight. My cover as an administrative assistant was not just pride, it was strategy. Because I knew exactly what my family was doing at the same time. The Wilson legacy was built on devouring weak companies at bargain prices. But what happens when those weak companies don't collapse? What happens when someone saves them before the vultures arrive? That someone was me. And as Summit Solutions grew quietly opening offices in city after city, my family never noticed. Or maybe they simply never cared enough to look past their own arrogance. One thing was certain: the girl they had laughed at had become the woman who now held the power to laugh last. And the game had only just begun. The memory of that first client never left me. I could still see the relief on the owner's face when his company turned a profit again. That moment was the spark that ignited everything. From then on, I lived in two worlds. By day, I played the role of the dutiful assistant. By night, I orchestrated strategies that reshaped entire corporations. My family never suspected a thing. They would ask me at gatherings about my little job, and I would describe mundane tasks, scheduling calls, filing papers, answering emails. Their eyes glazed over, and they quickly lost interest. That was exactly what I wanted. The less they cared, the more space I had to grow. But the truth was never small. As Summit Solutions expanded, I hired carefully. Each employee had to share my vision and my discretion. They signed contracts that bound them to silence. My name never appeared on press releases, financial filings, or client rosters. I was the ghost in the system, moving quietly, shaping outcomes, without ever stepping into the spotlight. Meanwhile, my family's empire relied on destruction. Wilson Ventures hunted failing companies, swooping in when the market saw no value. They would buy cheap strip assets and leave wreckage behind. I had grown up watching that cycle, power measured by how much you could consume. I decided my empire would be different. My business would not destroy. It would rescue. For every acquisition Wilson Ventures attempted, there was a chance my phone would buzz. Companies they targeted often came to Summit desperate for salvation, and when they did, I gave it to them. It wasn't just business, it was justice. Every company we saved was one less victim for my family. Every success was another blade against the legacy they worshipped. It took a decade, but Summit Solutions became one of the most influential consulting firms in the industry. 12 cities. A client list filled with Fortune 500 names. A reputation that terrified competitors but thrilled those we saved. All of it built under their noses, while they laughed about my secretarial work. Sometimes I wondered if they would ever notice. But arrogance blinds sharper than any mask. They were so convinced of my insignificance that they never looked twice. Their pride became my shield, and I wore it gladly. Still, the weight of deception was heavy. There were nights I stared at the ceiling, wondering how long I could keep both worlds alive. Yet every time doubt crept in, I remembered that night in the mansion, their laughter still echoing in my mind. That memory fueled me. It reminded me why I started and why I could never stop. There's a strange kind of strength that comes from being underestimated. When people think you're nothing, you're free to become anything. I embraced that. Their insults were bricks, and I built my empire from them. Looking back now, I realize how much of my power came not from their absence of belief, but from my refusal to surrender. Maybe you know what that feels like, being told no, being dismissed, being laughed at. But still you rise. You push forward. Because deep down, you know your worth even when no one else sees it. And in those quiet nights with the city lights glowing outside my office window, I whispered to myself, they'll see. One day, they'll see. That day was coming faster than any of us realized. Because destiny has a way of circling back to where it all began. The turning point came late one night as I sat in that cramped office above the Chinese restaurant. The neon sign outside flickered against the window, painting my desk in red and blue light. Papers were stacked so high, they seemed ready to topple. My bank account was bleeding my body, exhausted, but my mind was sharper than it had ever been. I realized then that what I had built was more than a business. It was a lifeline for people the world had abandoned. I leaned back in my chair and thought about my family. About the empire they cherished, built on the bones of companies they gutted for profit. I thought about Uncle Robert, about Ethan, about Patricia's smug smile. And I made a vow. I wasn't just going to survive. I was going to fight back. Not with shouting, not with fury, but with quiet victories that would strip away their power one piece at a time. Summit Solutions grew faster than I had dreamed. One client became three, three became 10. Each success was whispered from one business owner to another. There's a firm that can save you when no one else will. I was building something unstoppable. Every signature, every restructuring plan, every debt renegotiated was another brick in my invisible empire. And yet to my family I remained invisible. At reunions they kept asking me about my secretary work. I answered with a practiced smile describing trivial tasks like making copies or answering phones. Their eyes slid past me, eager to move on to conversations that mattered. They never realized those trivial tasks were my shield, and behind it I was shaping industries. It was tempting sometimes to reveal myself, to slam down documents on the table and show them exactly who I had become. But I knew better. Timing is everything. You don't reveal your hand until the game is almost won. I told myself over and over, stay patient, stay hidden, build quietly until no one can ignore you, and that is exactly what I did. But patience is not easy when the people closest to you dismiss your existence. There were nights I left reunions with tears burning in my eyes, forcing myself not to break the mask. And yet every insult, every cruel laugh, every jab about wasted potential fueled me further. Their contempt became the fire that kept me moving. If you've ever been pushed aside, if you've ever been told you'll never succeed, you know what that feels like. It cuts deep, but it also sharpens you. And if you're listening now, let me tell you, don't give up. If you've ever faced that kind of doubt, hit that subscribe button. Because this community is built for people who rise when others want them to fall. We're in this together. The vow I made that night above the restaurant became the foundation of everything. I wasn't just working for myself anymore. I was working for every underdog, every overlooked woman, every dreamer who had been told they weren't enough. And deep down, I knew the day would come when the mask would fall. When the truth would roar louder than their laughter. When the underestimated woman in the corner would become the only person in the room with real power. That day was closer than I realized. And when it arrived, nothing about the Wilson family would ever be the same again. Years passed, and the little office above the Chinese restaurant became more of a symbol than a workplace. I kept it even after we moved into a sleek headquarters downtown with glass walls and conference rooms that sparkled with polished steel. It reminded me of where I started, of the struggle that had sharpened me into who I was. Every time I stepped into that old space, the faint smell of sesame oil in the air, I remembered how far I had come and how much further I intended to go. Summit Solutions was no longer just a rumor. It had become a force. We operated in 12 cities, guiding Fortune 500 companies out of collapse and into profitability. Every success story strengthened our reputation. Competitors began to whisper our name with respect and fear. But outside those boardrooms and the gilded halls of Wilson family gatherings, I remained the quiet assistant. The duality was exhausting but necessary. When my family asked about my work, I told them stories so bland they were forgettable. I described answering phones, organizing calendars, making coffee. They nodded, half listening, before turning back to more important conversations. Their disinterest was my cloak, and I wore it gladly. Because in the shadows, I was doing more than answering phones. I was dismantling their empire from the ground up. Every time Wilson Ventures targeted a failing company, I watched closely. When the owners reached out to Summit, desperate to avoid being devoured, I intervened. We built strategies that revived those companies, making them immune to takeover. The Wilsons never realized who was blocking their acquisitions. They blamed bad luck, poor timing, or incompetent advisors. They never once considered the possibility that their own flesh and blood was the invisible hand behind their failures. It was poetic justice. The family that mocked me for being powerless was being undone by the power they never saw. And the best part, they gave me the perfect cover. They believed so strongly in my insignificance that they never bothered to look deeper. Their arrogance blinded them, and I let them stay blind. But deception has its cost. There were nights I lay awake wondering if I was losing myself in the mask I had created. Could I ever step into the light, or would I always be the ghost in the corner? Still, every time doubt threatened to consume me, I thought about that first night, how they laughed, how they dismissed me, how they told me to start in the mailroom like everyone else. That memory hardened me. It reminded me that everything I was building was not just for me. It was for every dreamer silenced by voices of contempt. One client at a time, I turned their contempt into proof. I turned rejection into revenue. I turned invisibility into influence. Summit Solutions was not just a company anymore, it was a statement. And though the Wilson family still thought I was nothing more than an assistant, the truth was becoming harder to hide. The victories were piling up, the companies we saved were thriving, and whispers of Summit's mysterious leader grew louder. I knew it was only a matter of time before the two worlds collided. My family's empire built on greed was beginning to stumble, and mine built on resilience was rising higher every day. The storm was gathering, and soon the mask I had worn for a decade would no longer be needed. The storm I had been waiting for finally began to break. It started with whispers at the reunion, little cracks in the Wilson facade. My uncle Robert had been chasing a company called Williams Manufacturing, a struggling firm he intended to strip and resell like so many others. But something had gone wrong. His acquisition attempt had stalled. At dinner, I watched his smile falter when someone asked about it. He brushed it off, claiming there were complications, but I knew the truth. Those complications were me. Williams Manufacturing had reached out to Summit Solutions 3 months earlier, desperate and on the brink. I had taken the call myself. Their CEO told me he had already been rejected by every major consulting firm in the city. He sounded defeated, almost ready to surrender to Robert's offer. But I laid out a plan step by step to restructure their operations, strengthen their position, and make their company untouchable. Now, months later, their stock price was climbing. Their employees were stable. Their debt was under control. Robert's easy target had slipped from his grasp, and he didn't even know whose hand had pulled it away. At that reunion, as I listened to him bluster and boast, my phone buzzed in my clutch. A message flashed across the screen. Emergency meeting scheduled for 9 the next morning. Wilson Ventures requesting merger discussion regarding Williams Manufacturing. Urgent response required. The irony nearly made me laugh out loud. After years of mocking me, after years of dismissing me as a glorified secretary, my family's empire was now forced to beg for a meeting with the very company they believed beneath them. And that meeting, it would be with me. I sat quietly in the corner, sipping champagne, and let the weight of that realization settle. Tomorrow I would not be the invisible assistant they thought I was. I would not be the woman bringing coffee. I would be the decision maker, the CEO they had underestimated for a decade. Have you ever felt that moment building inside you? That surge when you realize all the times you were overlooked are about to flip into power. If you've ever had a moment where you knew payback was coming, not with anger, but with undeniable proof. Tell me in the comments. I want to know how you turned doubt into triumph. That night I went home early telling Patricia I had an important meeting. She smirked, assuming it meant I was running errands for someone more important. But I already knew exactly what I would wear. No more black dresses meant to disappear. Tomorrow I would walk into the boardroom in a navy suit, a power color for a power move. As I laid out my clothes for the morning, I thought about all the years of hiding, all the times I had swallowed pride to maintain the mask, every jab, every laugh, every insult. They had fueled me to build something greater than I had ever imagined. Tomorrow the mask would fall, and when it did, they would finally see me for who I truly was. The assistant they mocked was gone. The CEO they could never control was about to take her place. Morning came with the weight of destiny pressing against my chest. I rode the private elevator up to Summit Solutions' executive floor, the hum of machinery beneath my feet, echoing like a drumbeat of war. Gone was the modest dress that had made me invisible for so many years. In its place was a navy suit tailored sharp, a statement that I no longer needed to hide. My assistant Maya was waiting for me at the door's tablet in hand. She gave me a knowing smile. The Wilson Ventures team arrived early, she said. Your uncle looks anxious. Ethan is here too, insisting he handle the legal side. Patricia came as well, and James' finance department. I couldn't stop the smile that tugged at my lips. A perfect audience. Every player who had laughed at me dismissed me, erased me now, sitting in my conference room, unknowingly waiting for me. Are they comfortable? I asked, adjusting my cuffs. Maya's grin widened. Your aunt already complained there was no one to serve coffee. I told her the administrative assistant would be in shortly. I laughed quietly, the sound sharp in the sleek hallway. For 10 years I had played the role of that assistant. I had carried coats, poured coffee, taken notes right in front of them. They never once looked closely enough to see the truth. Their blindness had been my greatest weapon. Give me 2 minutes, I said, then bring in the contracts. The conference room doors loomed ahead of me like gates to another world. I paused, listening to the voices inside. Robert's authoritative tone, Ethan's smug commentary, Patricia's sharp laugh, James flipping papers, all of them so certain of their power, so unaware that their world was about to collapse. I opened the doors. Silence hit like a wave. Robert sat at one end of the table, clearly assuming the position of authority. Ethan and James flanked him in expensive suits that screamed family wealth. Patricia perched nearby, examining her manicure as though the outcome was already decided. Across from them sat Mr. Harrison of Williams Manufacturing, looking uneasy and outnumbered. Patricia was the first to break the silence. We've been waiting for coffee. Emily, why are you standing there, and what are you wearing? I walked past her without hesitation and sat at the head of the table, the chair directly opposite Robert. My voice was steady, calm, and filled with the authority I had held inside for 10 years. I don't serve coffee anymore, Patricia, I said. In fact, I never really did. Robert slammed his palm on the table. What is this? Where is Summit's CEO? We were promised a meeting with the actual decision-maker. You have been, I replied, folding my hands on the polished wood. I am the CEO of Summit Solutions, and I have been since the day I founded the company 10 years ago. The silence that followed was deafening. Ethan's mouth opened and closed like a fish. James dropped his pen. Patricia's composure cracked eyes wide with disbelief, and Robert, his face turned crimson. I leaned back slightly, savoring the moment. 10 years of silence. 10 years of laughter at my expense. 10 years of invisibility. And now, at last, they were seeing me, truly seeing me for the first time. The mask had fallen, and the empire they believed untouchable was now in my hands. The room held its breath. My words hung in the air like thunder that hadn't yet rolled away. For a moment, no one moved. Robert's knuckles whitened as his grip on the table tightened. Patricia's lips parted, but no sound came out. James stared at his phone screen as if it might rewrite reality. And Ethan, poor Ethan, looked as though the floor had disappeared beneath him. Finally, Robert spoke, his voice trembling with fury. Absurd. You a secretary? This is a charade. Where's the real CEO? I smiled, calm and unshaken. Sitting right in front of you. 10 years of building 10 years of victories, and not once did you notice. That was your mistake. You were so certain I couldn't succeed that you blinded yourselves to the truth. Maya entered then, moving with purpose, carrying a stack of contracts. She placed them neatly on the table before me, her posture confident, her eyes locked on mine. She didn't need to say a word, her presence alone confirmed my authority. These documents, I began, my voice slicing through the silence, outline the terms under which Summit Solutions will consider approving the merger with Williams Manufacturing. Consider, Ethan sputtered. You can't be serious, this is a joke. I tapped my tablet and projected Summit's financials onto the massive screen at the end of the room. Numbers filled the space, undeniable, unforgiving. Summit Solutions currently manages over $122 billion in client assets. Our restructuring success rate stands at 94%. Williams Manufacturing thrives because of us. Their merger requires our approval, and right now I hold that approval in my hands. Their disbelief was almost comical. Patricia's composure cracked her voice, dropping to a whisper. Impossible. You've always been nothing. That's exactly what you were meant to think, I answered, turning to Mr. Harrison. Would you like to explain why you chose Summit Solutions over Wilson Ventures? He straightened, finding courage in the storm. Summit's restructuring plan saved us. Our profits have risen 47% since implementing their strategies. We would not exist today without them. James slumped back in his chair, realization dawning. The plan that blocked our acquisition, that was you. One of many, I said. I ticked names off on my fingers. Peterson Electronics, Maritime Shipping, the Davidson Group. Every company you tried to swallow and failed. That was me. For 10 years, I've been the shadow undoing your greed. Robert's face turned scarlet. You sabotaged family business. No, I corrected softly. I built my own. A business that saves instead of destroys. The fact it interfered with your schemes? Consider that karma. The tension in the room was electric. Their empire was crumbling in real time, and they knew it. But this was only the beginning. I had yet to reveal the final card in my hand, the move that would shift the balance forever. Because while they sat in disbelief, clinging to arrogance, I had already prepared the weapon that would end their dominance once and for all. And when they saw it, their laughter would never return. Stay with me, because what I revealed next was the blow that silenced them forever. The silence cracked when Ethan pushed back his chair so suddenly it screeched against the polished floor. His voice rose higher than he probably intended. I am calling our lawyers. This circus ends now. I didn't flinch. Sit down, Ethan. Maybe it was the tone of my voice. Calm, steady, unyielding. A tone he had never heard from me before. Whatever it was, it froze him mid-step. He lowered himself back into the chair, his face pale, his arrogance slipping away. I slid a folder across the table. Perhaps you should read those contracts in front of you first. You'll notice they cover the very merger you begged me for. And here's something else you might find interesting. Your law firm's biggest client this year was me. His eyes widened as realization struck. The color drained from his face, leaving him looking like a man caught in a trap. Because that's exactly what he was. Maya stepped forward with another document, placing it beside the contracts. This, I explained, is a summary of Summit's current market position. You'll see that we are not only stronger than Wilson Ventures, we are now in a position to acquire controlling interest in your company should we choose. The room erupted. Patricia gasped so loudly it echoed. James fumbled with his phone, desperately checking numbers that confirmed my claim. Ethan collapsed back into his seat, his hands trembling. Robert growled the word like a curse. Blackmail. No, I said quietly. This is business. The kind you told me I would never be capable of handling. I stood smoothing the fabric of my suit. You have until 5 o'clock today to review the terms. They are generous, considering our position. Refuse, and tomorrow morning, Summit Solutions begins purchasing Wilson Ventures stock on the open market. Their outrage was a symphony, but beneath it, I saw the truth. The fear in their eyes, the knowledge that they had already lost. For 10 years they mocked me, erased me, turned me into nothing more than a shadow in their minds. And now, in the span of one morning, that shadow had grown into the storm that threatened to consume them. I paused at the door, letting silence reclaim the room for one last moment. Then I turned back to them with a smile that was sharp as glass. Oh, and Patricia, the champagne you offered me last night. I own the vineyard now. Bought it last year. The coffee you demanded this morning. That chain, too. My salary does leave room for expensive tastes, after all. Patricia's mouth opened, but no words came. Robert's face was purple with rage. Ethan looked utterly broken, and James just stared at me as though seeing me for the very first time. Sometimes victory doesn't come with cheers or applause. Sometimes it comes in silence, the silence of people who finally understand the truth they tried so hard to deny. Tell me something, have you ever imagined what it would feel like to stand before the very people who doubted you and prove them wrong in one undeniable moment? If you've ever dreamed of that day, share it in the comments. I want to know what your moment of justice would look like. Because that morning I lived mine. And it was only the beginning, The war between Summit Solutions and Wilson Ventures was far from over, but for the first time, the battlefield was mine. The door clicked shut behind me, muffling the chaos that had erupted in the conference room. I let the silence of the hallway settle over me, a sharp contrast to the storm I had left inside. My hands were steady, my steps deliberate. For 10 years, I had prepared for this moment. And now, finally, the mask was gone. In my private office, Maya was waiting with a fresh cup of coffee, my blend from the very chain Patricia had sneered at hours earlier. She handed it to me with a grin that spoke volumes. Was it worth the wait, she asked. I took a sip, savoring the taste, every second. But the truth was, my work wasn't finished. I glanced at the clock. The Wilsons had until 5 o'clock to decide their future, and I knew exactly what would happen. Pride would push them to resist. Fear would pull them toward surrender. By the end of the day, they would bend. I thought about the contracts, the numbers I had projected on the screen. $122 billion in assets, a 94% success rate. These weren't just statistics, they were proof. Proof that I had built something powerful, something undeniable, something greater than their entire empire. For years I had been the ghost saving companies from the shadows, never revealing my name. But standing in that boardroom, I realized something. It wasn't just about revenge anymore. It wasn't even about justice. It was about ownership, owning my story, my power, my voice. And yet even as the victory settled around me, I couldn't help but think back to where it started. That first client, that tiny office above the restaurant, the smell of sesame oil in the vents, the late nights when I doubted myself but kept pushing anyway. Every piece of that journey had brought me here. Inside the conference room, my family had seen the numbers, but they hadn't seen the years. They hadn't seen the sacrifices. They hadn't seen the woman who gave up sleep money and security to build something real. To them, it was an ambush. To me, it was the culmination of a decade of resilience. I leaned against the window, looking out over the city's skyline. The towers of glass and steel glowed in the morning sun. Somewhere out there, business owners were working late, fighting for survival, praying for a lifeline. They didn't know my name, but they knew Summit. They knew what we stood for. That was enough. Still, the image of my family's faces lingered. The disbelief, the humiliation, the fear. It was a picture I would never forget, not because it proved I was right, but because it reminded me how blind they had been all along. They had never looked at me truly looked, and that blindness had cost them everything. I turned back to Maya. "This is just the beginning," I said. She nodded, already anticipating my next move. Because while the Wilsons were scrambling to salvage their pride, I was already planning the next strike. And soon they would learn that my victory wasn't a moment. It was a reign. By noon, the flood began. My phone buzzed relentlessly, calls, texts, desperate emails. Patricia tried to wrap her desperation in honey. "Darling, let's have lunch. You know you've always been my favorite niece." Ethan, stripped of his smugness, sent me a pathetic line. "Come on, Em. We were joking. Family sticks together." James tried the practical route. "You can't do this to us. We're blood." I ignored them all. Because while they scrambled, the Wilson Ventures board was far less sentimental. By 3 o'clock, they held an emergency meeting. By 4, they had voted to accept my terms. And by 5, their empire bent at the knee. The roar of victory was quiet. No trumpets, no applause. Just signatures on paper binding them to a new reality. Summit Solutions was no longer just their competitor, it was their future. But Robert wasn't finished. He stormed into my office, unannounced rage twisting his features. "You've betrayed this family!" He spat, his voice echoing against the glass walls. Maya stepped forward to intervene, but I lifted a hand. Let him rage. He deserved the chance to exhaust himself. I didn't look up from my computer. I'd say I learned from this family, wouldn't you seize power? Eliminate competition. Never show weakness. "You ungrateful child," he growled. "We gave you everything." That made me laugh. I turned to face him at last. "Everything you gave me, nothing but contempt. You told me I would never be good enough, that my only value was supporting the men, so I built something better. I built it without you. For the first time, I saw the fight drain from him. He sank into a chair, suddenly looking older than I'd ever seen him. Why reveal yourself now? He asked, almost pleading. You could have kept operating in secret forever. Because it was time, I said simply, Williams Manufacturing isn't the only company you're circling. Thompson Electronics, Maritime Solutions, 3 more firms you plan to dismantle. I'm done watching you destroy. It stops now. I slid a folder across the desk. These are the final merger terms. Summit will acquire controlling interest in Wilson Ventures. We will restructure it to focus on building companies up, not tearing them apart. You can stay on as a consultant if you accept the new direction. If not, your golden parachute is outlined on page 3. His hands trembled as he opened the folder. You thought of everything. I learned from the best, I said coldly, just not in the way you intended. He left without another word, and as the door closed behind him, I felt the shift. The war was ending, but the transformation was only beginning. The newspapers were already buzzing. Headlines screamed about the secret CEO, about the woman who had built an empire under her family's nose. Overnight, Summit became a household name, and the Wilson dynasty became a cautionary tale. But that was not the true twist, not yet. Because what came next would prove that this battle was never about revenge alone. But it was about rewriting the rules of power forever. Stay with me because the revelation that followed was bigger than anything my family or the press could have imagined. The following weeks were a storm of headlines and interviews. Everywhere I turned, the story was the same. The secret CEO, the hidden empire, the woman who fooled her family for a decade. Reporters dug through Summit's history, piecing together how we had blocked Wilson Ventures time and time again. To the public, it was the ultimate tale of poetic justice. To my family, it was humiliation broadcast across every screen. Patricia tried damage control first. In one interview, she put on her best pearls and a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. We always knew Emily had potential, she told the cameras. This just proves the Wilson spirit of entrepreneurship runs in the blood. I didn't let that slide. I released archived footage from the last reunion, a 20-minute clip of Patricia explaining to the family why I would never amount to anything. The video went viral within hours. The public saw the truth, her words contrasted against the empire I had built. Patricia vanished from the press circuit soon after. Ethan's fall was quieter, but just as brutal. He tried to spin the narrative, claiming he had been in on the secret all along, that he had supported me from the shadows. Unfortunately for him, too many people had witnessed his shocked face in that boardroom. His law firm's clients lost confidence. Within a month, he was asked to take a leave of absence. James, on the other hand, adapted quickly. He invited me to an awkward lunch, pitching a Wilson Summit alliance that would dominate the market. I let him finish his speech before I shook my head. Summit doesn't dominate, I told him. We elevate. He didn't know how to respond. But beyond the family drama, something else began to happen. My inbox filled with messages from women across industries. Young interns wrote to me saying my story gave them hope. Executives shared their own experiences of being underestimated, silenced, or ignored. Invitations poured in from business schools asking me to speak. For the first time, I realized the impact of my revelation reached far beyond my family. This wasn't just about proving the Wilsons wrong. It was about proving what women everywhere had always known, that underestimation is not weakness. It is camouflage. To anyone listening right now who has ever been underestimated, dismissed, or told you didn't belong, this story is for you. And if you believe in building a community where voices like ours are heard, make sure you subscribe. Because this channel isn't just about storytelling, it's about creating a place where we rise together. Every empire built on arrogance eventually crumbles. The Wilsons had built theirs on the assumption that women like me could never lead. That mistake cost them everything. My empire built on silence, resilience, and strategy was only growing stronger. The tabloids called it revenge, the business papers called it genius, but I called it something else, justice. And I wasn't done yet. Because the next stage of my journey would prove that tearing down an empire was only the beginning. The spotlight that once burned so harshly on the Wilson name now turned toward me. Summit Solutions was no longer just a consulting firm, it had become a symbol. The press could not get enough of the story, the woman who had built a billion-dollar empire in secret, the family who never saw it coming, the empire that had been humbled by one of its own. But the true victory wasn't in the headlines. It was in the quiet transformations I began to witness. At a conference 3 months later, I stood on stage accepting the Business Innovation Award. As I looked into the crowd, I saw faces that mattered: my mother, who had walked away from the Wilson family years ago to protect herself from their poison, smiling with tears in her eyes. Behind her sat several of my former assistants, women who had helped me maintain my cover while building their own careers within Summit. They weren't shadows anymore. They were leaders. I spoke with conviction. Success isn't about who holds the most power. It's about how you use it. For 10 years, I let people underestimate me. I could have revealed myself sooner, but I chose patience. Because real change requires more than victory, it requires strength to create something better. The applause thundered, but what stayed with me wasn't the noise. It was the young woman who approached me afterward, tears streaming down her face. She whispered, "Thank you for showing me that success doesn't have to mean compromise, that I don't have to choose between being underestimated and being strong." That was the real reward. Not the money, not the headlines, not even the humiliation of my family. It was the ripple effect, the proof that one story could inspire countless others. Meanwhile, the Wilson empire continued to fracture. Patricia retreated into silence. Ethan vanished from the legal world. James lingered on the edges, trying to find relevance in a world that no longer revolved around his last name. And Robert, once the iron pillar of the family, finally stepped down. His resignation letter contained words no one expected. My niece taught me that true business success isn't measured in acquisitions or assets, but in the impact we create. I regret it took losing control to learn this lesson. Hearing those words even in print felt surreal. I had not sought his respect, yet in the end, my fight had forced him to see a truth he never would have admitted otherwise. But this wasn't just about them. This was about rewriting what power looked like. For decades, the Wilsons had equated power with destruction. I had proven that power could be something else, that it could elevate, protect, and inspire. And in that transformation, I found something I hadn't expected: peace. Justice had been served, yes, but more importantly, a new foundation had been laid. One where the next generation would not have to hide or play small or swallow humiliation just to survive. Because sometimes the greatest revenge isn't destroying what others built. It's building something stronger in its place. And as I stood in the glow of that stage award in hand, I knew the real story was only beginning. The months that followed were a whirlwind, yet for the first time in a decade I felt free. No more hiding behind a mask, no more playing the role of the silent assistant. The world finally saw me for who I was, a woman who had built her own empire from the shadows. Summit Solutions had not only merged with Wilson Ventures, but had reshaped it entirely. Instead of tearing down companies, we focused on rebuilding them. Partnerships flourished, stock prices climbed, and the fear once attached to the Wilson name was replaced by respect for Summit. I knew I had changed the course of my family's legacy forever, but more importantly, I had changed the course of my own. The next reunion loomed, but this time I wasn't the reluctant guest standing in the corner with a glass of champagne. I was the host. I chose the venue carefully, our main conference room at Summit headquarters, the very room where I had once served coffee in silence. Now it was the stage where the family would gather under my leadership. As I prepared, I thought about the symbolism. 10 years ago, they had laughed at me in that mansion, convinced I would fade into obscurity. Now they would sit at my table on my terms, facing the truth they had tried to deny. But it wasn't about vengeance anymore. It was about transformation. They could cling to the past if they wished, but I had already moved forward. I had built something too strong, too resilient to ever be dismissed again. That afternoon before the reunion began, I stood by the window overlooking the city. Maya entered quietly holding a folder. "Everything's ready," she said. I nodded my reflection in the glass, looking back at me. Not the quiet assistant they had erased, not the invisible woman they had mocked, but a leader powerful and unafraid. As the family filtered in their footsteps hesitant, I welcomed them with the same grace they had denied me for years. They looked around the conference room, remembering the countless times they had sat there, never realizing the woman serving their coffee was the one pulling every string. Now there were no illusions left. I smiled, lifting my glass. "Welcome," I said simply. "This time the future of our family is not built on tearing others down. It is built on lifting them up." The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was transformative. For the first time, they listened. And as I stood at the head of the table, I realized something important. Success had never been about proving them wrong. It had always been about proving myself right. Have you ever imagined that moment standing before the people who doubted you and showing them the life you built without their help? If you've ever dreamed of turning doubt into triumph, don't just hold on to that dream. Share it. And before you go, make sure to watch the next story on this channel. It might be the push you need to keep building your own empire. Because your story matters. And maybe one day you'll be the one at the head of the table. That day I wasn't just the host of a reunion. I was the living proof that the underestimated can and will rise. When the reunion ended and the conference room grew quiet again, I remained at the head of the table. The glasses had been cleared away, the voices of my family faded into silence, but the energy of the moment lingered. For years, I had imagined what it would feel like to stand in this exact spot, no longer invisible, no longer underestimated, no longer erased. And now I knew. It didn't feel like triumph in the way I once dreamed. It felt calmer, deeper, almost like peace. I thought about the countless nights in that tiny office above the restaurant when exhaustion pressed so heavily on me that quitting seemed easier than continuing. I thought about every cruel word spoken by those who claimed to love me, every laugh that cut into me, every dismissal that pushed me to build something greater. All of it had led to this, but this story was never just about revenge. It was about creating space for myself and for others. Space for businesses to thrive instead of collapse. Space for women to lead without apology. Space for the underestimated to discover that invisibility can be a kind of power. That small desk above the Chinese restaurant still sits there untouched. I keep it as a reminder. Success doesn't always announce itself with flashing lights or gilded titles. Sometimes it grows quietly, patiently, until one day it steps into the light and changes everything. As I turned off the lights in the conference room, I carried that truth with me. Justice had been served, but more importantly, a new chapter had begun. And in that chapter, I was free to lead, free to inspire, free to build a future where no one is dismissed for daring to dream. Because the real secret to success isn't the power you show. It's the power you build when no one is watching.